There is a particular kind of quiet that settles over you when you step through an ancient doorway and understand, somewhere deep and wordless, that you have entered a place that has been holding its breath for centuries. Not the quiet of emptiness, not the quiet of abandonment, but the quiet of accumulation, of weight, of so many centuries of human intention pressed into stone and pigment and marble, that the air itself feels dense with meaning, as though even the dust floating in the amber light knows something you do not yet know. That is the feeling of the Vatican Museums. Tonight, we are going to walk slowly through those galleries, not the way a tourist rushes through with a map held at arm's length, neck craned upward, moving from famous painting to famous painting like a traveler checking items off a list. We are going to move the way you move through a dream, unhurried, a little weightless, drawn forward by curiosity rather than urgency. We are going to look at things that have been stared at by millions of eyes, and we are going to find the parts those eyes skipped over, the whispered details, the things painted for the few rather than the many, the symbols left like locked doors in the walls of one of the most powerful institutions in human history, waiting for someone patient enough to find the key. The Vatican Museums are, on their surface, exactly what they appear to be, an astonishing collection of art and antiquity gathered by the Catholic Church over more than 500 years, housed in a labyrinthine complex of palaces and corridors on a small hill in Rome. That much is true and undisputed, but surfaces, as we will discover tonight, are where the real work of concealment begins. Every room we pass through carries more than one conversation. Every fresco painted on those high walls was made by someone who understood that the person paying for the work would read it one way, and that posterity, or perhaps a careful observer standing very still in a corner, might read it another way entirely. Artists working in the Vatican during the Renaissance were not simply craftsmen executing the wishes of their patrons. They were thinkers, anatomists, philosophers, and sometimes quiet dissidents, encoding their truest thoughts into the very walls of the institution that employed them. To walk through the Vatican Museums without knowing this is to walk through a library and read only the titles of the books. So let us begin to read more carefully than that. Before we begin to move through specific rooms and specific objects, let us take a moment simply to stand at the entrance and feel the full weight of what this place is. Because the Vatican Museums are, before they are anything else, a threshold, a place of transition between one kind of experience and another. People arrive here from every country on earth, carrying every variety of expectation and preparation. Some are scholars who have spent their careers thinking about what is inside. Some are pilgrims for whom the visit is a devotional act. Some are tourists who found a free afternoon and thought, why not? Some are children dragged along by adults who are slightly more enthusiastic than they are. And all of them, regardless of what they brought with them, tend to leave having experienced something they did not fully anticipate. Because the Vatican Museums do not simply present art, they construct an experience that operates on multiple levels simultaneously: the visual, the architectural, the historical, the theological, and the subtly emotional register that is difficult to name but impossible to ignore. There is a quality to the light in certain rooms of the Vatican that you do not encounter in many other places. It is the quality of light that has passed through the same high windows for a very long time, that has illuminated the same surfaces repeatedly until there is a kind of visual memory in the space itself, as though the rooms have absorbed so much looking that they now look back. This is, of course, a subjective impression. The light is ordinary Roman light, filtered through ordinary glass. But the mind, in a place this old and this dense with human intention, has a tendency to find meaning in the quality of illumination, just as the artists who worked here found meaning in everything they touched. That tendency, the human tendency to see significance, to find patterns, to decode the world into layers of meaning, is both the subject of tonight's journey and its method. We are not here to be told what things mean. We are here to practice the art of looking carefully enough that meanings begin to offer themselves. The Vatican Museums require patience more than knowledge. They reward stillness more than speed. They are, in this sense, a very good place to begin a sleepy evening, because the way you must move through them, if you want to see them truly, is exactly the way the tired mind moves in the last hours before sleep, slowly, associatively, letting one thing lead to the next without forcing the connection, trusting that the path will make sense when you reach the end of it. So, the gate is behind us, the city is behind us. Let us walk forward, slowly, into the stone corridors that contain the largest single argument about human knowledge and divine authority ever assembled in one place. Picture the approach. You are moving through Rome on a warm evening, the city's ancient stones still giving off the heat they absorbed during the afternoon. The Tiber slides past to your left, heavy and slow, the color of old bronze. Ahead of you, the dome of St. Peter's Basilica rises against a sky that has gone the deep, bruised blue of late dusk, its silhouette so familiar from paintings and photographs that seeing it in person carries a strange doubling feeling, as though you are recognizing something you have only ever seen in a dream. You pass through the walls. The world outside, the noise of the city, the motor scooters and coffee bars and laundry hung from upper windows falls away behind you, and you find yourself in a different country, literally. Vatican City is its own sovereign state, the smallest in the world by area, and yet it contains more concentrated human artistry per square meter than almost anywhere else on the planet. The museums themselves are housed in a series of connected palaces and galleries, their total floor area so vast that even the curators do not all know every room. More than 70,000 works of art are held within these walls. Of those, only around 20,000 are on display at any given time. The rest sleep in storerooms and archives, wrapped in cloth, waiting. The corridors are long and cool. The ceilings are high. Sound behaves differently here. Your footsteps have a particular resonance, as though the floors are made of something more than stone, as though the building itself is listening. Tonight, we are the ones who have come to listen back. And before we go any further, if this kind of slow, calm journey through history helps you settle your mind and drift towards sleep, I would be so grateful if you could like this video and subscribe to the channel. My name is Heyo, and I make boring history for sleep, And right now, I am working toward 1,000 subscribers, which is a milestone I truly cannot reach without you. If you have a moment, like the video, leave a comment telling me where in the world you are listening from and what time it is on your clock. And if you have any sleepy hype left, any at all, send it this way. It means more than you can imagine. Now, dim the lights a little more. Settle into whatever surface you have found for the night, and let us continue. That man was Pope Julius II, born Giuliano della Rovere, elected to the papacy in 1503, and possessed of an energy and ambition that made even the Romans, who were accustomed to powerful men, slightly nervous. Julius is sometimes called the warrior pope because he personally led military campaigns and rode into battle in full armor at an age when most men had long since handed those ambitions to younger shoulders. But he was also something else, a man with an almost physical need for beauty, for magnificence, for art that matched the scale of his sense of his own historical importance. In 1506, the year Julius commissioned Michelangelo to paint the Sistine Chapel ceiling, a commission Michelangelo famously tried to refuse, something extraordinary was dug out of the ground in Rome. In a vineyard on the Esquiline Hill, workers uncovered a marble sculpture that had been buried for more than 1,000 years. It was a work that the ancient Roman author Pliny the Elder had described in his writings as the greatest sculpture ever made, the Laocoon group. We will spend more time with that sculpture later tonight because it carries its own remarkable symbolism. But what matters for now is what Julius did with it. He sent his architect Giuliano da Sangallo to inspect it, and within days of its discovery, the sculpture had been acquired by the Pope and moved to a small garden courtyard in the Vatican Palace called the Cortile del Belvedere. That courtyard is the seed from which the entire Vatican Museums grew. Julius began placing other important sculptures there. The Apollo Belvedere, which had been in the Vatican's possession since the 1480s, and several other classical works. He did not think of this as a museum. The concept did not yet exist in its modern form. He thought of it as a collection of beautiful and powerful objects worthy of being near him. But the effect was the same, a deliberate gathering of art brought to one place, arranged with intention, accessible to a select audience. Over the following decades and centuries, each successive pope added to what Julius had begun. Pope Clement VII, Pope Paul III, Pope Gregory XVI, who founded the Egyptian Museum in 1839, Pope Pius IX, Pope Leo XIII. Each one layered something new onto the collection. A gallery here, a wing there, a new acquisition of ancient statues or medieval manuscripts or Renaissance paintings or modern religious art. The complex grew the way a great city grows, not by plan, but by accumulation, each generation building on and around what the previous one had left behind. By the time the Vatican Museums were formally opened to the public in 1837, because for most of their history they were accessible only to invited guests, scholars, and those with powerful connections, they contained a collection of such depth and variety that it was impossible to see everything in a single visit, or a dozen visits, or perhaps even a lifetime of visits. Today, the museums occupy an area of roughly 5.5 hectares. The 26 separate galleries and collections include the Gregorian Egyptian Museum, the Gregorian Etruscan Museum, the Gallery of Candelabra, the Gallery of Tapestries, the Gallery of Maps, the apartment of St. Pius V, the Sobieski Room, the rooms of the Immaculate Conception, the Raphael Rooms, the Borgia apartment, the collection of modern religious art, the Sistine Chapel, the Vatican Pinacoteca or Painting Gallery, and several others. But here is the thing that gives this whole institution a peculiar, almost surreal quality, and the thing that makes every symbol within it carry an extra layer of meaning. This is not simply a museum, it is also the working residence of the Pope. The Apostolic Palace, which contains many of the most important rooms we will visit tonight, is not a monument, it is a living building. The history it contains is not dead history. It is the ongoing history of one of the world's oldest and most influential institutions, still in operation, still making decisions that affect the lives of more than 1 billion people. When you stand in the Raphael Rooms and look at frescoes painted in the early 16th century, you are standing in a space that has never stopped being used. Popes have walked those same corridors every day for 500 years. The symbols on those walls were not painted for posterity. They were painted to be seen every day by the most powerful religious authority on earth. Which means that every symbol had to do double work, satisfy the patron and speak the artist's truth, satisfy the institution and leave a door open for the careful observer. It is no wonder the walls have so much to say. The collection also carries, in its very construction, a kind of symbolic statement about power. In the ancient world, controlling beautiful things was a way of controlling meaning. Roman emperors displayed conquered art as proof of their dominion over the civilizations they had defeated. The Egyptian obelisks scattered around Rome, several of which are visible from Vatican City, were not brought to Italy because Romans found them aesthetically pleasing, though perhaps they did. They were brought because owning an obelisk was a way of saying, we conquered the people who built this. Their gods belong to us now. Their mysteries are ours to keep or reveal as we choose. The Vatican took a different approach, but the underlying logic is not entirely unrelated. By gathering the art of the ancient world, pagan, classical, pre-Christian, and placing it in the care of the Church, the institution was making a claim. Not just that beauty belongs to everyone, but that the Church is the custodian of all human culture, that sacred and secular knowledge flow toward the same center, that Rome and the papacy stand at the convergence of all civilizations. That claim is woven into every room of the Vatican Museums. It is the first great symbol of the place, and it speaks before you have even looked at a single painting. It is also worth pausing, in the spirit of full honesty, to acknowledge what this collecting history cost. Not every work in the Vatican collection arrived through benign or voluntary channels. Napoleon's removal of hundreds of works to Paris in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, many of which were returned after his defeat, though not all, was simply the most recent and most documented instance of a practice that had been occurring since the earliest days of the collection. Works moved from their original contexts, removed from the communities and buildings for which they were made, reframed within the logic of a collection that organized them according to the Vatican's priorities rather than their own internal logic. This is not a reason to diminish the collection. It is a reason to hold it with a certain complexity, to see it not only as an astonishing gift to human civilization, which it genuinely is, but as an institution with the full weight of history behind it. The symbols inside the Vatican Museums are meaningful not just for what they reveal about art and theology and the Renaissance imagination, but for what they reveal about the nature of power itself, about how authority is constructed, maintained, and expressed through the control of beautiful things. The museums are, in this sense, honest. They do not hide what they are. Every room declares its own history, its own purpose, its own politics. The symbols are not accidental. The accumulation is not random. Everything is here because someone decided it should be here, and those decisions, tracked across 5 centuries, constitute a kind of autobiography of the institution, its aspirations, its anxieties, its moments of genuine generosity, and its moments of raw, unambiguous power. To walk through the Vatican Museums slowly is to read that autobiography in the most vivid possible form. Section 3. The Sistine Chapel Ceiling and the Brain of God. You have arrived, as every visitor eventually does, at the Sistine Chapel. The room is longer than it is wide, about 40 meters long and 13 meters wide, its dimensions matching those given in the Bible for the Temple of Solomon, which is itself not a coincidence, but an early signal that even the architecture here is trying to tell you something. The floor is inlaid in a gentle pattern of colored marble. The lower walls are hung with tapestries, and below those, painted panels from the 15th century show scenes from the lives of Moses and Christ, painted by artists including Botticelli, Ghirlandaio, and Perugino, before Michelangelo ever set foot in the space. But of course it is the ceiling you are looking at. It is always the ceiling. Michelangelo painted the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel between 1508 and 1512, a period of 4 years, during which, by all accounts, he was in a near constant state of physical misery and creative exaltation. He lay on scaffolding in the dark, paint dripping onto his face, working in conditions that damaged his eyesight and bent his spine. He was 33 years old when he began. He had not wanted the commission. He considered himself a sculptor, not a painter, and he suspected, with some justification, that the commission had been arranged by his rivals to embarrass him, to give him a task he could not complete. The ceiling covers roughly 12,000 square feet and contains more than 300 individual figures, organized into a program of extraordinary complexity and theological ambition. 9 scenes from the Book of Genesis run down the center of the ceiling, flanked by the figures of Hebrew prophets and pagan sibyls. Ignudi, young male figures whose symbolic meaning has been debated for centuries, sit at the corners of each central scene. And in the 4 corners of the ceiling, large triangular scenes depict moments of salvation from Jewish history. All of this the Pope saw. All of this was visible, intended, sanctioned, celebrated. And before we reach the hidden anatomical messages, it is worth pausing to appreciate the sheer ambition of what the ceiling accomplished on its surface, because the concealed meanings are only interesting in proportion to how thoroughly and how beautifully the surface program does its job.
The 9 central Genesis scenes run from the creation of light at the altar end to the story of Noah and the flood at the entrance end. This sequencing runs backward from the traditional direction of biblical narrative. Michelangelo began painting from the entrance end and moved toward the altar, which means he painted Noah first and creation last, working from consequence back to origin, from the human story of failure and survival back to the first breath of divine intention. The result is that a worshipper entering the chapel and looking up sees the whole story flowing from origin to outcome in the natural direction of reading. But Michelangelo painted it against the grain, back to front, beginning with what humanity became and working toward what it was made to be.
This reversal is itself suggestive. The story we read as progress from creation towards salvation is also a story of increasing complexity and loss. The figures in the panels painted first, near the entrance, are smaller and more naturalistic, reflecting Michelangelo's awareness of the spatial constraints and his initial uncertainty. The figures in the later panels, near the altar, are larger, more powerful, more boldly conceived. God creating the world is rendered at the peak of Michelangelo's confidence, with a freedom and authority he had not yet found when he began. The ceiling enacts its own creation narrative in the history of its own making. From the age of 17, Michelangelo had been secretly dissecting human corpses. He had access to bodies from the church graveyard of Santo Spirito in Florence, and he spent years cutting into human cadavers and studying what he found with the meticulous attention of a man who believed that understanding the body from the inside out was the only way to represent it truthfully from the outside. This was not simply unusual, it was technically illegal and considered deeply transgressive by the Church, which held that the human body, as the vessel of the soul, was sacred and ought not to be cut open. Michelangelo destroyed almost all of his anatomical sketches before he died. He did not want to be caught, but he could not bring himself to leave all of it behind. He painted it into the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel instead.
In 1990, an American physician named Frank Meshberger published a paper in the Journal of the American Medical Association, making an observation that once seen cannot be unseen. In the central scene known as the creation of Adam, the most famous image on the ceiling, the one in which God's finger nearly touches the outstretched finger of a reclining Adam, the shape surrounding God and the angels around him is not a random cloud or a flowing cloak. It is a perfect anatomical cross-section of the human brain. The outline of the shape matches the cerebrum, the cerebellum, the brainstem and the spinal cord with a precision that could not be accidental in a man of Michelangelo's anatomical knowledge. The green scarf trailing below the figures maps precisely onto the basilar artery. The figure of a woman beneath God's left arm, perhaps Eve, perhaps divine wisdom, sits exactly where the pituitary gland would be. Meshberger suggested that Michelangelo was proposing something radical and entirely his own, that what God gives to Adam in that moment of creation is not simply life, but intelligence, not simply the animating spark of existence, but the supreme gift of the human brain, the capacity to reason, to observe, to understand. God in Michelangelo's ceiling reaches across the space between divinity and humanity and gives Adam a mind.
The church, which commissioned and paid for this ceiling, had no idea this message was in it. It looked at a beautiful image of creation and saw exactly what it wanted to see: divine grace flowing downward from God to man. Michelangelo let it see that. But underneath that approved reading, he embedded a second message, visible only to those who knew what a brain looked like, only to those who had, as he had, held one in their hands. And he did not stop there.
In 2010, two neurosurgeons from the Johns Hopkins University School of Medicine, Ian Suk and Rafael Tamago, published a paper in the journal Neurosurgery, focusing on a different panel near the altar end of the ceiling. The scene is called the separation of light from darkness, and it shows God with arms raised, face tilted upward, his neck and chest visible in the composition. Art historians had long noted that something was odd about this part of the figure. The neck seemed disproportionate, the lighting inconsistent with the rest of the painting, as though the area had been deliberately highlighted in a way that did not match the illumination logic of the rest of the scene. Suk and Tamago found that the shape of God's neck in this panel is not a neck at all. It is a precise depiction of the human brainstem viewed from below, an unusual angle that would be meaningless to someone who had not dissected a brain and studied its lower structures. The brainstem, the temporal lobe, the medulla oblongata, each structure is present and correctly positioned.
And in the same panel, the twists of God's red robe trace the path of the optic nerves in a way that matches a diagram made by Leonardo da Vinci in 1487. Michelangelo and Leonardo were contemporaries who were aware of each other's work. Both were anatomists in secret. Whether Michelangelo knew Leonardo's drawing specifically is uncertain, but the visual correspondence is precise enough to make coincidence feel very unlikely. A 2016 study in the journal Clinical Anatomy by researchers in Brazil extended this analysis further, identifying potential representations of female anatomical structures embedded in several panels of the ceiling. Structures that would have been particularly transgressive to include, given the Church's attitudes toward the body and toward women's bodies specifically. These findings remain more debated than the brain imagery, but they point in the same direction, towards a ceiling that is systematically more than it appears, built by a man who was using the most sacred space in Christendom as a private laboratory of radical ideas. Why would he do this? Part of the answer lies in Michelangelo's relationship with the institution for which he worked. He was deeply religious, there is no serious doubt about that. His later poetry returns obsessively to themes of sin, redemption, and the love of God. But his relationship with the Church as an institution, with the men who ran it, with their attitudes toward knowledge and the body and the independent human intellect, was considerably more complicated. He was a man who had been taught by the Medici circle in Florence, by Neoplatonist philosophers who believed that classical learning and Christian faith were not in conflict, but in harmony, that the wisdom of Plato and the teachings of Christ pointed toward the same truths. The Church of Pope Julius II was not always comfortable with that view. The men who employed him were not always the men whose vision of the divine matched his own. And so he painted. He gave them what they asked for, and he hid inside it everything they would not have accepted if he had asked their permission. The brain of God, visible to anyone patient enough to look, invisible to anyone looking only for what they expected to see. The ceiling of the Sistine Chapel is many things. It is a masterpiece, it is a theological program, it is 4 years of a man's life pressed into pigment and plaster, and it is, if you know where to look, one of the most extraordinary acts of intellectual defiance in the history of art, hidden in plain sight, 100 feet above the altar, for 500 years. Section 4. The Last Judgment and the Skin that Speaks. Come back now to the Sistine Chapel, but to the altar wall this time, not the ceiling, because more than 20 years after finishing that ceiling,
Michelangelo returned.
He was in his 60s now. The energy of his 30s had given way to something more exhausted and more searching. Rome had been sacked in 1527 by the armies of Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, a catastrophe so violent and so thorough that it permanently changed the character of the city, and it permanently changed the character of the men who had lived through it. Michelangelo had survived by hiding. By the time Pope Paul III called him back to paint the altar wall of the Sistine Chapel, he was a man who had seen what religious institutions were capable of when the people inside them forgot their ideals and reached for power instead. The Last Judgment, completed in 1541, is not a comfortable painting. The official reading is clear enough. It depicts the moment described in the Christian tradition when Christ returns to judge the living and the dead, separating the saved from the damned. Christ stands at the center, muscular, commanding, one arm raised. The saved rise to his right side. The damned are pulled downward to the left. Angels blow trumpets. Saints hold the instruments of their martyrdom. The Virgin Mary sits beside Christ, her face turned slightly away. But look more carefully at specific figures, and a different conversation begins.
On the lower right side of the painting, at the edge of the realm of the damned, there is a figure from ancient mythology. His name is Charon, the ferryman of the dead from Greek and Roman tradition, and he is beating the souls of the condemned into his boat with an oar, preparing to carry them across the river to hell. Charon is not a Christian figure. He comes from the Aeneid of Virgil, from the pre-Christian imagination of death and the underworld. He has no theological justification for being on the altar wall of the most important chapel in Christendom. Michelangelo put him there anyway. Just above Charon, there is the figure of Minos, the judge of the underworld in classical mythology, depicted with the ears of a donkey and a serpent coiling around his body. Art historians have long believed that this figure is a portrait of Biagio da Cesena, a papal master of ceremonies who loudly criticized the painting during its creation, calling it obscene and more appropriate for a bathhouse than a sacred space. Michelangelo painted his critic's face onto the Lord of Hell, gave him donkey ears, and left him there permanently on the altar wall, where every subsequent ceremony would require the Pope to face the painting. It remained. No one removed it. Paul III, when told that Cesena had complained about the portrait, reportedly responded that his jurisdiction did not extend to hell, and there was therefore nothing he could do. But the most personal symbol in the entire painting is quieter than all of this. It is a piece of skin. On the right side of the figure of Christ, slightly below and behind him, stands the figure of Saint Bartholomew, a martyr who, according to tradition, was flayed alive, skinned from the living body as his method of execution. He holds as his attribute the knife of his martyrdom, and in his other hand he holds his own skin, a loose, deflated shape, the skin of a man drained of the body it once covered. The face on that skin is the face of Michelangelo. It is unmistakable to anyone who knows Michelangelo's portraits, and it is deeply strange. Not because a Renaissance artist including a self-portrait in a major work was unusual, it was not. Raphael painted himself into the School of Athens. Botticelli painted himself into scenes in the Sistine Chapel's lower walls. Self-portraiture in major commissions was almost a convention. But this is not Michelangelo standing nobly in the crowd.
This is Michelangelo as empty skin, as the discarded husk of a man, as something that has been peeled away from everything that once animated it. The interpretation most art historians find compelling is one of profound spiritual anxiety that Michelangelo, in his 60s, warned by decades of labor and compromise and the weight of having worked all his life for patrons whose power he both needed and resented, was painting a meditation on his own emptiness, on the question of whether there was anything left of himself beneath the work, on whether a man who had spent his life making things for others had anything remaining that was truly his own. The empty skin hangs in the air of the painted heaven, neither saved nor damned, caught between the two realms, exactly where Michelangelo may have felt himself to be.
It is one of the most intimate and devastating things painted in the Vatican Museums, and it is painted there in full view on the most prominent wall in the most visited room, and most people who see it never notice what they are looking at. There are other details in the Last Judgment that reward slow attention. In the upper left corner of the composition, angels carry the instruments of the Passion: the cross, the crown of thorns, the column at which Christ was scourged. But these angels do not float elegantly. They strain and labor. The cross is heavy. The weight of these objects, which in Christian iconography are supposed to be symbols of triumph and redemption, is rendered by Michelangelo with a physical literalness that makes them feel like burdens rather than trophies. The saved are not floating upward effortlessly. They are being pulled, hauled, lifted by other figures, some of them with the exertion of the effort visible in their bodies. This choice to make salvation physical, to make the journey toward the divine a matter of effort and muscle rather than effortless grace, is consistent with Michelangelo's broader theological sensibility. He was not a man who found comfort in easy answers. His Christ in the Last Judgment is not the gentle shepherd of pastoral tradition. He is athletic, commanding, his arm raised not in blessing but in judgment, closer in feeling to the Apollo Belvedere standing in its courtyard than to the traditional image of the merciful Redeemer.
This caused controversy in his lifetime. Cardinal Caraffa and Monsignor Cernini objected that the nudity of the figures was inappropriate for a sacred space. Pope Paul IV, after Michelangelo's death, commissioned Daniele da Volterra to paint draperies over the most exposed figures, an act that earned the painter the nickname Il Braghettone, the trouser maker, and that was extended by further additions in subsequent centuries. Some of these additions were partially removed during the restoration of the 1990s, though the fresco retains many of its added coverings to this day. What they were covering, of course, was not simply nudity, but Michelangelo's insistence that the human body, mortal, imperfect, beautiful, and strange, deserved to be present in the most sacred space available, that the soul's journey towards God was also the body's journey, that you could not paint the truth about salvation without painting the truth about flesh. The last person you see as you leave the Sistine Chapel, if you know to look, is not Christ. It is Michelangelo, hanging empty in the air, a skin without a body, a name without a form, somewhere between the saved and the damned, watching you go. This was the private library and signing chamber of Pope Julius II, the room where the most important papal documents were signed and sealed, where the business of the Church's intellectual authority was transacted.
and Julius wanted the walls of this room to reflect the totality of human knowledge as the Church understood it. He gave the commission to a young painter from Urbino who had arrived in Rome around 1508. The same year, Michelangelo, in the room next door, was beginning the Sistine ceiling. The young painter was 26 years old. His name was Raffaello Sanzio. We know him as Raphael. The four walls of the Stanza della Segnatura are organized as a program representing the four domains of human knowledge: theology, philosophy, poetry, and justice. The theological wall gives us the Disputa, showing the Church triumphant in heaven above and the Church militant on earth below, gathered around the Eucharist. The poetical wall gives us Parnassus, with Apollo and the Muses. The legal wall gives us the cardinal and theological virtues, and the philosophical wall gives us what is arguably the most intellectually complex painting of the Italian Renaissance, the School of Athens. The scene is set in an imagined classical hall of breathtaking scale, vaulted arches receding into a distant sky, statues of Minerva and Apollo in the niches, the architecture itself a fantasy of Roman grandeur. And within this space, Raphael has gathered more than 50 figures representing the greatest thinkers of the ancient world. Philosophers, mathematicians, astronomers, scientists, all of them drawn together into a single idealized moment that never happened and could never have happened, because they came from different centuries and different countries, and several of them would probably have had serious arguments with one another if forced to share a room. That impossibility is the point. Raphael was not painting history. He was painting an idea, the idea that knowledge is continuous, that the great minds of antiquity belong to the same conversation, and that the Catholic Church, which had commissioned this room, stands in legitimate succession to all of them. It was a bold intellectual claim, and Julius understood it and approved of it. The pagan philosophers of ancient Greece were not positioned as rivals to Christian thought, but as precursors, as people who were reaching toward the same truths from a different direction. At the center of the composition, framed perfectly by the arch behind them, stand two figures who give the painting its central argument. On the left is Plato, an old man with a long beard, holding his dialogue the Timaeus under one arm and pointing upward with one finger of his other hand. On the right is Aristotle, younger and more vital, holding his ethics and gesturing with his palm downward toward the earth. This gesture, Plato pointing up, Aristotle pointing down, is the painting's thesis, its simplest and most profound symbol. Plato's philosophy held that true reality was not found in the physical world, but in a higher realm of abstract forms, eternal, perfect, and accessible only through reason and contemplation, hence the upward gesture. Aristotle, by contrast, believed that knowledge was grounded in the observation of the physical world, that the senses were the foundation of understanding, that the proper study of philosophy was the world you could touch and measure, hence the downward gesture. Two fingers, two directions, and between them the entire history of Western philosophy's central debate compressed into a single image. But then there is something else, visible only in the final version of the fresco on the wall, something that was not in Raphael's preparatory drawing, which survives in Milan. In the foreground of the painting, slightly to the left of center, slumped against a block of marble and writing in a notebook, is a solitary, dark-robed figure who appears to be ignoring everyone around him. He is isolated from the conversations of the other philosophers. He does not look up, He has the heavy, brooding air of a man who finds the company of others a mild inconvenience. This figure represents Heraclitus, the ancient Greek philosopher known for his doctrine that everything is in constant flux, the thinker who said that you cannot step into the same river twice. But his face does not belong to Heraclitus. It belongs to Michelangelo.
Raphael added this figure to the fresco at a late stage. The technical evidence shows that the plaster in that section was applied separately after the main fresco was complete. He returned to the wall and inserted this portrait of his greatest contemporary, the man who was painting the ceiling literally a few corridors away, as a tribute and perhaps also as a provocation. The choice of Heraclitus as the vehicle is rich. Heraclitus was known in antiquity for his melancholic, his difficulty, his refusal to make things easy for his audience. He was called the Dark One and the Riddling One. He believed in the unity of opposites, in the tension between contradictions as the engine of the universe. He believed most people were too comfortable in their assumptions to see clearly. In other words, Raphael painted Michelangelo as the philosopher who thought everyone else was missing the point. He gave him a face that carries the weight of everything Michelangelo was in reality: exhausted, brilliant, slightly contemptuous of the world, and utterly unreachable. Michelangelo, it is said, was moved by the tribute. He was also reportedly a bit irritated by it, because Raphael had seen inside the Sistine Chapel without permission and incorporated some of Michelangelo's figure style into his own work. But the portrait remained, and it remains to this day, the man who painted the most famous ceiling in the world, sitting in the corner of someone else's fresco, scribbling in a notebook, paying no attention to the grand philosophical argument happening around him.
And there is one more detail to notice in the School of Athens. In the lower right corner of the composition, a young man stares directly out at the viewer from within the scene, breaking the fiction of the painting, making eye contact. He is standing among the mathematicians and astronomers, and he looks as though he has just noticed you watching. This is Raphael himself, his own self-portrait, signed not with a name, but with a gaze. He stands among the great minds of antiquity and looks at you as if to ask, "Do you see it? Do you understand what I have built here?" Section 6. The Borgia Apartments and Pinturicchio's Dangerous Frescoes. Most visitors moving from the Raphael rooms towards the Sistine Chapel pass by a set of doors that open into a suite of rooms below the Raphael rooms without a second glance. The crowds flow past. The audio guides say something general, and so the Borgia apartments are left most days in a relative calm that their history perhaps does not deserve. These 6 rooms were the private apartments of Pope Alexander VI, born Rodrigo Borgia, the head of the most notorious family of the Renaissance, elected pope in 1492. The Borgias were Spaniards in a city that distrusted Spaniards. They were also, depending on who you believe, poisoners, murderers, patrons of extraordinary art, and political operators of such cynical efficiency that they achieved things no merely virtuous person could have achieved. Alexander VI was the father, openly, not even particularly secretly, of several children, including Cesare Borgia, who became the model for Machiavelli's Prince, and Lucrezia Borgia, whose reputation history has been only partially kind about.
Alexander commissioned the decoration of his apartments from a Perugian painter named Bernardino di Betto, known as Pinturicchio, meaning the little painter, who worked on them from around 1492 to 1495. The frescoes Pinturicchio produced are extraordinary things, rich and strange, combining Christian imagery with classical mythology in a way that the more strictly orthodox members of the Church found, to put it gently, irregular. The first room, the Room of the Sibyls, places 12 pagan prophetic women, the Sibyls of ancient tradition, alongside 12 apostles, as though the Christian New Testament and the pre-Christian prophetic tradition are equal branches of the same tree. This was actually a defensible theological position in the Renaissance, where the Sibyls were often argued to have predicted the coming of Christ. But the visual equivalence Pinturicchio gives them, the way the Sibyls and apostles face each other across the room as equals, goes somewhat further than pure theology required. In the Room of the Creed, the apostles and prophets of the Old Testament are given equal visual weight. Again, the emphasis on continuity between traditions that the Church might, if pressed, have preferred to present as a clean rupture rather than a continuation. But the most intriguing room is the Room of the Saints, where several of the frescoes depict Christian saints in settings borrowed entirely from Egyptian mythology. The bull god Apis wanders through a scene of the life of Saint Anthony. The Osiris myth provides the backdrop for another composition. Hieroglyphs appear on monuments in the backgrounds, not as random decoration, but in patterns that, in a few cases, scholars have argued are deliberate rather than purely ornamental.
This Egyptian imagery connects to a thread running through the Borgia family's self-mythology, their claimed ancestry from the Egyptian god Osiris through the ancient lineage of the bull. The family symbol of the Borgias was a bull, and Alexander deployed this symbol with the enthusiasm of someone who genuinely believed it carried ancient power. And then there is a panel in the Room of the Saints that art historians point to with particular excitement, a fresco depicting the resurrection of Christ. In this painting, behind the risen Christ, several figures are visible in the background, and two of them appear to wear feathered headdresses and carry themselves with a bearing that is distinctly non-European. Some scholars have argued that these figures are among the earliest European artistic representations of Native Americans, painted in 1494, just 2 years after Columbus's first voyage to the Americas. Columbus's arrival was contemporary news when Pinturicchio was working. The Borgias were deeply connected to Spanish interests. It is entirely plausible that news and perhaps even visual descriptions of the people Columbus had encountered had already reached Rome. If this identification is correct, the Borgia apartments contain, hidden in a resurrection scene, one of the first attempts by a European artist to incorporate the visual reality of a world that Europe had just encountered for the first time. Tucked into the background of a sacred painting, easily missed, easily overlooked, two figures from across the ocean standing in the painted hills of Judea, staring out across 500 years. Section 7. The Gallery of Maps, Geography as Power.
Walk now through one of the most visually overwhelming corridors in the entire Vatican Museums complex. It is 120 meters long, about the length of a football field, and every centimeter of its walls and ceiling is covered in painted imagery. On the ceiling above you, rich and elaborate scenes drawn from the history of the Church, and on both sides, extending the full length of the corridor, 40 enormous painted maps of Italy and its surrounding territories. This is the Gallery of Maps, completed between 1580 and 1585 for Pope Gregory XIII, the same pope who commissioned the calendar reform that gave us the Gregorian calendar, still in use today.
The maps were painted by a Dominican friar and cartographer named Ignacio Danti, and they represent the most complete geographic survey of the Italian peninsula made in the 16th century. They are also one of the most elaborate and sustained symbolic statements of power in the entire Vatican Museums. Consider what a map is at its deepest level. A map is a claim. It says, I know this territory. I have measured it, understood it, and rendered it into a form I can hold and control. The act of mapping a place is an act of assertion, of saying that this territory exists within my sphere of knowledge, my sphere of concern, my sphere of authority.
Gregory XIII placed 40 of these claims in a single corridor that anyone walking from the Vatican Museums towards the Sistine Chapel had to pass through. Every visitor, every ambassador, every cardinal, every powerful figure given access to the Pope's domain walked through this gallery before reaching the sacred spaces beyond it. They walked between these maps the way you walk between the columns of a temple, and the message they received was quiet but unmistakable. The Church sees everything. The Church knows everything. The Church holds the entire world within its gaze. The maps are organized with symbolic precision. Italy is depicted divided into two halves, the regions facing the Tyrrhenian Sea on one side and those facing the Adriatic on another. This organization reflects a geographic logic, but it also reflects a spiritual one. The Pope's domain as the axis of the known world, the point from which all directions are measured. At the center of the gallery, a map of the city of Rome itself. Not at the beginning, not at the end, but at the midpoint, the center of the center, the point around which everything else orbits. The ceiling decorations above the maps are not merely decorative. Each ceiling scene corresponds to the region depicted on the wall below it, showing miraculous events or historical victories associated with that territory. Battles, conversions, apparitions of the Virgin. Each map is paired with a proof that God's favor rests on that land, and by extension, on the institution that records and celebrates these miracles.
Look also at the compass roses and wind roses embedded in several of the maps, decorative circular elements that mark directions and winds. In the cartographic tradition of the Renaissance, these elements carried a double meaning. They were practical navigational tools, but they also had a symbolic resonance, connecting to the ancient idea of the winds as divine forces, the breath of God moving over the face of the world. Placing them within a papal gallery transforms them from navigational symbols into theological ones, God's breath, God's directions, God's knowledge of the world. The gallery of maps is not subtle. Its symbolic language is relatively legible once you know to look for it, but its sheer scale gives it an almost overwhelming quality. 120 meters of claimed knowledge, 40 declarations of surveillance and understanding, and at the end the door to the Sistine Chapel, the sanctum at the heart of it all, reachable only by those who have passed through the geography of power. But there is a quieter dimension to the gallery of maps that the grandeur of its political symbolism can obscure.
In many of the individual map panels, the towns and regions depicted are labelled with their Latin names, names that in some cases had not been in common use for centuries, names that reached back to the Roman world and its memory of what each territory was called before the complications of medieval history layered new names over the old ones. This use of Latin names is not merely scholarly precision, it is a claim of historical continuity, the papacy inheriting not just the spiritual authority of the early church, but the geographic and administrative memory of Rome itself.
The cartographic tradition that produced these maps was also a scientific one. Ignazio Danti was not just an artist, he was a mathematician and astronomer who had contributed to the Gregorian calendar reform and who understood map-making as a scientific discipline grounded in measurement, observation, and the careful reduction of three-dimensional space to two-dimensional representation. The maps in the gallery are, by the standards of their time, impressively accurate. The coastlines, the mountain ranges, the courses of rivers, they are not merely decorative approximations, but genuine attempts at geographic precision. This combination of science and theology, of measurement in the service of meaning, is characteristic of the Vatican's intellectual project at its most coherent. The Church did not see itself as the enemy of knowledge, it saw itself as the custodian of all knowledge, including the knowledge that the natural world provides. The maps in the gallery are therefore a statement not just of political authority, but of intellectual authority, the claim that the Church not only rules over this territory, but understands it, has measured it, and holds its shape in the mind as well as in the hand. Section 8. The Laocoon Group and the Language of Suffering. Return now to the place where the Vatican Museums began, the octagonal courtyard of the Belvedere, where Julius II placed the first great sculptures of his collection and created, without quite intending to, the museum that everything else would grow from. The sculpture we want to stand before is the Laocoon Group, and it is, quite possibly, the most consequential single work of art in the Western tradition. In January of 1506, workers digging in a vineyard on the Esquiline Hill in Rome struck something hard. As they dug further, three intertwined marble figures emerged from the earth, a man and his two sons, wrapped in the coils of two enormous serpents. The man's face is thrown back in agony. His body twists against the constriction of the snakes. His sons strain and struggle at his sides, one already beginning to go limp. This was the Laocoon, the subject of a famous passage in Pliny the Elder's Natural History. Pliny had described it as, in his estimation, greater than any other painting or sculpture, and he attributed it to three sculptors from Rhodes. Michelangelo was among the witnesses brought to the site of its discovery, and by his own account, he was so moved by what he saw that he stood speechless in the vineyard for a long time. Julius moved it to his Belvedere courtyard, and within weeks of its public display in Rome, it had begun to change the course of Western art. The story behind the sculpture comes from both the Aeneid of Virgil and from Greek myth. Laocoon was a Trojan priest of Apollo or Neptune, depending on the source, who warned his people that the wooden horse left by the Greeks should not be brought inside the walls of Troy. His advice, if followed, would have saved the city. But the gods who had already decided that Troy should fall were not going to permit Laocoon's good sense to interfere with their plans. Two enormous sea serpents came ashore and attacked him and his sons, killing them before the Trojans' eyes. The Trojans, interpreting this as divine punishment for Laocoon's impiety, brought the horse inside the walls.
Troy burned.
The symbolism of the Laocoon is therefore layered and dark. It is a depiction of someone who was right being destroyed for being right. A man who understood the truth, spoke the truth, and was killed precisely because the truth was inconvenient to powers greater than himself. The agony on his face is not simply physical. It is the agony of a man who can see clearly and cannot make anyone listen, and who suffers the consequences of other people's willingness to ignore the obvious for the sake of what they want to believe. Renaissance artists and thinkers looking at this sculpture saw several different things in it simultaneously. They saw, in purely technical terms, a challenge. How do you render human emotion and physical extremity in marble? How do you make stone convey the last breath of a man dying in agony? The Laocoon answered that question in the most extreme way possible, and every sculptor who saw it was forced to reckon with what it had achieved. Michelangelo incorporated lessons from the Laocoon's anatomical extremity directly into his work. The twisting, straining, physically pushed to the limit figures of the Sistine Chapel ceiling, the Ignudi, the Prophets, the Sibyls, carry the Laocoon's physical vocabulary. The way a body moves when every muscle is engaged, the way skin pulls taut over bone and sinew when a person is exerting themselves beyond what should be possible.
But there is a theological dimension too. The Laocoon entered the Vatican collection at a moment when the Church was deeply invested in the question of how suffering should be depicted and interpreted. Christian art had its own tradition of representing pain, the crucifixion, the martyrdoms of saints, and the question of how to show a body in extremity without making the image simply horrifying was one that painters and sculptors wrestled with constantly. The Laocoon offered a pagan answer to a problem that Christian art was still working through. Its presence in the Vatican was a statement that the visual language of suffering transcends the religious categories used to explain it. There is also in the Laocoon a subtle tension in the way the two sons are rendered. The older son appears more distressed, more fully engaged with the horror of what is happening. The younger son, on the right, seems almost resigned. His arm extends downward in a gesture that suggests not struggle, but release. Some art historians have read this contrast as intentional, a meditation on the different ways a person can respond to inescapable fate, resistance and resignation, the scream and the silence. The question of which is more dignified, or more human, or more honest, has no clean answer, and the sculpture leaves it unresolved, as perhaps it should. The Laocoon has been in the Vatican since 1506. For more than 500 years, it has been doing what the best works of art do, asking a question it does not answer, and making it impossible to look away.
There is also a quieter dimension to the Laocoon's symbolism that is worth sitting with for a moment. The sculpture was made, in all likelihood, by artists who understood the story of Laocoon as a tragedy of silence, of a truth that was spoken and not heard. In many ancient versions of the myth, the gods who silenced Laocoon did so not because he was wrong, but precisely because he was right. Divine will required Troy to fall. Therefore, the person who might prevent Troy's fall had to be removed. The truth he spoke was not refuted or disproved. It was simply cancelled by an overwhelming application of force. The Romans who lived with this sculpture in their collections, the Renaissance artists who were remade by encountering it, the visitors who stand before it today,
All of them are looking at a monument to the experience of knowing something and being unable to make that knowledge matter. This experience, which is both ancient and entirely contemporary, is part of why the Laocoon has never stopped feeling relevant. Every age has its Laocoons, people who see clearly, speak plainly, and are destroyed not for being wrong, but for being correct at a moment when correctness is inconvenient to power. That this sculpture lives in the Vatican, an institution that has had its own complex history with people who spoke truths it found inconvenient, adds yet another layer to its residence here. Whether any pope who looked at it in the Belvedere courtyard allowed himself to see that layer is a question the courtyard will not answer. Section 9. The Augustus of Prima Porta. Propaganda written in stone.
From the octagonal courtyard, move now to the new wing, the Braccio Nuovo, a neoclassical gallery built in the early 19th century to house works that Napoleon had borrowed and then been persuaded to return. Here, in a room of marble and vaulted ceilings, stands a sculpture that is less immediately dramatic than the Laocoon, but in some ways more quietly remarkable, because it is a piece of political propaganda so perfectly executed that it has spent 2,000 years being admired rather than recognized for what it is. The Augustus of Prima Porta takes its name from the site where it was discovered in 1863, the villa of Livia, the wife of the Emperor Augustus, near the road to Prima Porta north of Rome. It is a marble copy of a bronze original, roughly 2 meters tall, and it shows Augustus Caesar in a pose borrowed directly from the Greek sculptural tradition, specifically from a famous 5th century Greek work called the Doriphoros, or spear-bearer, a sculpture that represented the ideal proportions of the male body. Augustus stands with one arm raised in the gesture of an orator addressing the Roman people, his weight on his right leg, his left slightly advanced. He is barefoot, which in the Roman tradition indicated divine or heroic status. Ordinary mortals wore shoes. A small figure of Cupid rides a dolphin beside his right ankle. All of this is visible on the surface. All of it is part of the language of Roman imperial imagery, familiar and legible. But the real conversation is happening on the breastplate. The breastplate of Augustus is covered in carved relief, and every figure on it is a symbol carefully chosen to tell a story about the legitimacy of Augustus's power and the cosmic significance of his reign. At the center of the breastplate, a bearded figure, representing a defeated Parthian enemy, hands a legionary eagle standard back to a Roman figure. This scene refers to a specific historical event. In 20 BCE, the Parthian Empire returned the military standards that had been captured from Roman legions at the Battle of Carrhae in 53 BCE, a humiliation that had haunted Rome for 30 years. Augustus achieved this return not through military conquest, but through diplomacy. But the breastplate does not show diplomacy, it shows submission. It shows a defeated enemy returning what had been taken. The visual language claims a military victory that was actually a negotiated settlement. Above this central scene, a figure of the sky god Caelus stretches out a billowing canopy above the other figures, the heavens themselves arching over the triumph of Roman power. The sun god Sol rises on one side. The moon goddess Luna descends on the other. Below, the personification of the earth, Terra Mater, reclines and offers fruits and a cornucopia. The whole cosmic order, sky, sun, moon, earth,
is arranged to frame and endorse the political act at the center. On either side of this central drama, figures representing conquered provinces and Roman military alliances stand as witnesses, present, subdued, organized. The known world arrayed in support.
The dolphin beside Augustus's ankle, carrying Cupid, is a genealogical claim. Augustus claimed descent from Venus through his adoptive father Julius Caesar, and Venus was associated with dolphins as the goddess who rose from the sea. Cupid, her son, is Augustus's divine ancestor. The inclusion of this small figure at the emperor's feet quietly declares that the man wearing this breastplate is not simply a successful general and politician. He is the descendant of gods. His rule is not merely legitimate, it is cosmically ordained. Every element of this sculpture is a word in an argument, and the argument is the reign of Augustus is not the result of civil war and political maneuvering, though it was, in fact, the result of civil war and political maneuvering. It is the culmination of divine will, cosmic order, historical destiny. The sculpture stood in the private garden of Livia, Augustus's wife, and one of the most powerful women in Roman history. It was a domestic object, not a public monument, and yet its symbolic program is as complete and precisely constructed as anything intended for the forum. The propaganda did not turn off when the public was not watching. Standing before it in the Vatican today, you are looking at a 2,000-year-old lie, told in the most beautiful and technically accomplished language available. And the lie is, among other things, a useful reminder that the tools of visual symbolism have always been available to power, and that beauty has never been a reliable guide to truth.
There is a courtyard in the Vatican that most visitors see only briefly from an upper window or in passing. A vast open space framed by the wings of the museums, named for a single object that stands at its center. It is called the Cortile della Pina, the courtyard of the pine cone, and the object it is named for is a bronze pine cone roughly 4 meters tall, sitting on a high pedestal, surrounded by 2 bronze peacocks. This pine cone is older than Christianity. It is older than the Vatican. It may be older than Rome itself, or at least as old as the oldest layers of the city. Its true origin is uncertain. The most plausible scholarly identification places it as a Roman fountain ornament from the 1st or 2nd century, possibly associated with the Temple of Isis or the Pantheon, though neither attribution is certain. What is certain is that by the 8th century it had been installed in the atrium of the old St. Peter's Basilica, where it served as the centerpiece of a fountain, and that when the new St. Peter's was built in the 16th century, the pine cone was moved to the courtyard, where it remains today. The symbolic history of the pine cone is strikingly consistent across cultures and centuries. In ancient Roman imagery, the pine cone was associated with Jupiter, the king of the gods, and with the pineal gland, the small structure in the center of the human brain that produces melatonin and regulates sleep and waking cycles. The philosopher René Descartes, writing in the 17th century, identified the pineal gland as the seat of the soul, the point of connection between the immaterial mind and the physical body.
He arrived at this not from nowhere, but from a long tradition traceable back to ancient Greek and Roman thought of associating the pine cone's shape with spiritual perception and inner awakening. The pine cone's shape echoes the scales of a fish, the segments of a pineapple, the spiral arrangement of seeds in a sunflower, all natural forms governed by the Fibonacci sequence, the mathematical pattern that appears throughout living things and has been interpreted across many cultures as evidence of a divine order underlying the visible world. The spiral itself, as an emblem of the relationship between the finite and the infinite, between the center and the expanding periphery, is one of the most ancient and widely distributed symbols in human visual culture. Pine cones appear in the hands of gods in ancient Assyrian sculpture. They appear in the imagery of Dionysus, the Greek god of wine and transformation, whose staff, the thyrsus, was topped with a pine cone. They appear in Hindu imagery and Buddhist art. The pineal gland itself, in various esoteric traditions, has been called the third eye, the organ of spiritual insight, the part of the human anatomy through which inner light is perceived. All of this converges in a bronze cone standing in the center of the Vatican's largest courtyard. The two bronze peacocks flanking the pine cone have their own symbolic history. In the ancient world, peacocks were associated with immortality, partly because their flesh was believed to be incorruptible, resistant to decay even after death, and partly because the eye-like pattern of their tail feathers suggested the all-seeing gaze of divine surveillance. They were used in Roman funerary art as symbols of the soul's ascent after death. They were adopted by Christian imagery as symbols of resurrection and eternal life. In the center of the courtyard, at a lower level than the pine cone itself, stands a sculpture by the contemporary Italian artist Arnaldo Pomodoro, a large bronze sphere with its outer surface cracked open to reveal a smaller, more complex sphere within. This work, called Sphere Within Sphere, exists in multiple versions in museums and public spaces around the world, but the Vatican version has a particular resonance in this context. The outer sphere, smooth and golden, cracks and fractures to reveal an inner mechanism of extraordinary intricacy, gears and bars and complex geometries, the image of a world whose smooth surface conceals a much more complex reality within. In a courtyard built around a 2,000-year-old emblem of inner vision, surrounded by the walls of an institution whose surfaces have concealed complex realities for centuries, Pomodoro's sphere feels less like a coincidence and more like a conversation. Section 11. The Gallery of Tapestries and the Woven Resurrection. Between the Gallery of Maps and the Raphael Rooms, there is a gallery that receives somewhat less attention than its neighbors, partly because it is sandwiched between more famous spaces, and partly because tapestries, as an art form, do not always receive the reverence that painting and sculpture do. Visitors tend to glance rather than linger. They move quickly from one to the next. This is a loss, because the tapestries in the Vatican's Gallery of Tapestries are among the most technically extraordinary objects in the entire collection, and they contain a series of visual puzzles that are, once noticed, very difficult to stop thinking about. The tapestries were woven in the 16th century in Brussels, the center of the European tapestry industry, based on designs by students of Raphael after Raphael's own death in 1520. They depict scenes from the life of Christ, with particular emphasis on the appearances of the risen Christ after the resurrection. 8 tapestries show post-resurrection scenes, the appearances to Mary Magdalene, to the disciples at Emmaus, to the disciples gathered in the upper room, and others. What makes these tapestries remarkable, technically, is the use of perspective. Creating the illusion of three-dimensional space in a woven textile is extraordinarily difficult. The medium works in flat planes, colors placed next to colors, threads crossing threads. There is no equivalent of the painter's ability to blend, to glaze, to build up layers of pigment. And yet the tapestries in the Vatican Gallery achieve a depth and recession of space that rivals contemporary painting, their figures modeled with light and shadow as convincingly as any fresco, their architectural backgrounds receding toward vanishing points with geometric precision. But here is where the symbol appears. In the tapestry depicting the appearance of Christ to the apostles, sometimes called Doubting Thomas, sometimes more broadly the appearance in the upper room, Christ stands at the center of the composition, his hands raised, displaying the wounds in his palms. The apostles react with expressions of awe and recognition. The space around the figures is detailed with columns, arches, floor tiles in a geometric pattern. Look at the floor tiles. In several of the tapestries, the floor pattern is not random decoration. It traces a geometric program based on the octagon, a shape that, in Christian symbolic tradition, represents the transition between the earthly and the divine. The number 8 was associated in early Christian thought with the resurrection and with the day beyond the 7 days of earthly time, the 8th day, the day outside ordinary time, the day of the new creation. Baptisaries across Europe were built in octagonal form for exactly this reason. Baptism was understood as entry into the 8th day, into the time of resurrection. By patterning the floors of the post-resurrection scenes with octagonal geometry, the tapestry designers embedded the theological meaning of the scenes into the architecture of the imagery itself. The floor declares, for those who know to read it, that this is not ordinary space. This is resurrection space. This is the 8th day, made visible in woven wool and silk.
And on the right side of the painting, Pope Leo IV stands on the loggia of St. Peter's Basilica and makes the sign of the cross. The fire immediately goes out. This is the symbol the room was built to convey, that the Pope possesses miraculous power, that his blessing can extinguish fire, that divine authority, exercised through the papal office, operates directly on the physical world. The painting is not simply illustrating the historical event. Though the fire did occur, and Leo IV did reportedly pray for it to stop, and it apparently did, it is making a claim about the nature of papal authority that is both religious and political. The room was commissioned by Pope Leo X, not Leo IV, and painted in the years just after Leo X's election in 1513. Leo X shared his predecessor's name deliberately in the painting, and the implication was legible to anyone who knew how to read it. The miracle that Leo IV performed is the kind of miracle that papal authority enables. The institution that Leo X now headed was an institution through which God worked directly on the world. This was not an idle theological claim in 1513. Martin Luther was already moving towards the crisis that would become the Reformation. The authority of the papacy was about to be challenged in the most fundamental way it had ever been challenged. The walls of the Raphael rooms were, in part, a visual argument in a dispute that was beginning to define the shape of European history.
The room called the Stanza di Eliodoro, the Room of Heliodorus, takes its subject from the second book of Maccabees, the story of a man named Heliodorus who entered the temple in Jerusalem to steal the treasury and was struck down by divine intervention, a mounted warrior and two angelic assistants appearing from nowhere and beating him to the ground. In Raphael's fresco, the scene is depicted with theatrical force, and in the upper gallery to the left, the commissioning Pope, Julius II, watches from a litter carried by his attendants. He watches as God physically intervenes to protect the sacred treasury from theft. The political reading of this image for anyone at the court of Julius II was clear. Julius had spent much of his papacy fighting to reclaim territory that had been taken from the church by political and military forces. The fresco was a declaration that God was on the side of those who protected the church's holdings. The divine warrior who struck down Heliodorus was, by implication, available to strike down anyone who attempted to take what belonged to Rome. In the ceiling of the Stanza della Segnatura, where the School of Athens lives, 4 circular medallions contain allegorical female figures representing theology, philosophy, poetry, and justice. These are the 4 walls personified, the 4 domains of human knowledge given form. But their arrangement is also significant. They are not arranged randomly. Theology sits directly above the disputer, philosophy above the School of Athens, poetry above Parnassus, justice above the virtues. Each allegorical figure crowns the argument below her, as though the ceiling is blessing the walls, as though the abstract endorses the specific.
It is an enormous room doing an enormous amount of work. Every inch is in conversation with every other inch. The walls talk to the ceiling responds to the walls, and in the middle of it all, a visitor stands and tries to find the still point around which everything orbits. Section 13. Ancient Gods in a Christian Palace. There is something that becomes clearer the longer you spend in the Vatican Museums, something that the institution itself might, depending on the century, have been reluctant to acknowledge directly, though it is visible everywhere you look. The Vatican is full of pagan gods. Not as cautionary examples, not as symbols of what Christianity replaced, but as beautiful, cared for, admired presences, sculptures given places of honor, treated with reverence, displayed in the best light. The Apollo Belvedere stands in the octagonal courtyard with the unhurried confidence of a god who knows he is exactly where he belongs. He is a marble copy of a bronze original from around the 4th century BCE, and he depicts Apollo, the god of the sun, of music, of poetry, of light and plague and healing, at a moment just after he has shot an arrow. His arm is still extended, his cloak flows behind him. His face is serene with a certainty that seems to transcend the specific moment of the sculpture and speak to something permanent and unreachable. When Michelangelo first saw the Apollo Belvedere, he reportedly stood before it for a long time and called it, in different accounts, the summit of art, or simply, this is the one. The Apollo has been in the Vatican since at least the 1480s. It has been central to Western aesthetics ever since. Johann Winckelmann, the 18th century German art historian who essentially founded the modern discipline of art history, held up the Apollo Belvedere as the single greatest work of art ever made, the perfect embodiment of noble simplicity and calm grandeur. That assessment has been significantly revised since, but the sculpture's presence in the Vatican collection has shaped the Western visual imagination for 500 years. And it is a pagan god, housed in the palace of the Pope, displayed next to Christian relics and Renaissance devotional paintings. The Belvedere torso is an even stranger presence. It is a fragment, just the torso and upper thighs of a male figure, seated on a rock, the head and arms and legs all missing. It was probably made in the 1st century BCE, and it may depict Hercules or Ajax, or possibly a river god. Scholars are not certain. What is certain is that Michelangelo revered it, studied it obsessively, and is said to have refused to have it restored to completeness because he felt that the fragment was, as it stood, already perfect. When asked later in his life why he had not included some figures in the Sistine Chapel, he reportedly spread his hands and gestured toward an imaginary torso, indicating that the Belvedere torso had already said what needed to be said. Pope Clement IX apparently had plans to restore the torso and complete it, and Michelangelo is said to have strongly argued against this. In later centuries, when academic sculptors did attempt restorations of ancient fragments, the results were often profoundly mediocre compared to the originals. The wisdom of leaving the Belvedere torso incomplete was recognized eventually. It sits in its room in the Vatican as Michelangelo's ghost wanted it to sit, as a suggestion rather than a statement, as a beginning rather than an end. The presence of these pagan figures in the Vatican is not accidental, and it is not merely historical accident. It reflects a deliberate theological and intellectual position, one that the Renaissance papacy held with varying degrees of comfort at different times, but that was consistently expressed in the collecting decisions of successive popes. The classical tradition was not the enemy, it was the ancestor. The gods of Greece and Rome were not demons to be driven out, but predecessors to be respected, studied, and gently corrected by what had come after. This position has a name. It is called Christian humanism, and it was one of the defining intellectual currents of the Renaissance. The attempt to show that the wisdom of the ancient world and the revelation of Christianity were not in conflict, but in harmony, that the best of human reason pointed in the direction that faith confirmed.
The Vatican Museums are, in their organization and their collecting choices, the largest single architectural argument for Christian humanism ever assembled. The pagan gods are in the Christian palace, not despite the institution's identity, but because of it, because the institution believed, at least in its most intellectually generous moments, that beauty and truth belong to everyone who has ever reached for them, regardless of the names they used for what they found. Section 14. The Caravaggio in the Pinacoteca and the Theology of Darkness. There is a painting gallery in the Vatican Museums, the Pinacoteca Vaticana, that most visitors rushing towards the Sistine Chapel manage to miss entirely. This is a genuine loss, because it contains, among other things, a painting that is one of the most startling things you will ever see. Not startling in the way that surprises you with color or scale or subject, but startling in the way that grabs you by the shoulder and makes you look at something you would have preferred not to see so clearly. The painting is The Entombment of Christ by Michelangelo Merisi, known from his birthplace as Caravaggio. It was painted around 1602 and 1603 for the Vitrici Chapel in the Church of Santa Maria in Vallicella in Rome, and it came to the Vatican's collection in 1797, when Napoleon, in one of his more culturally acquisitive moods, had it taken to Paris. It was returned in 1816, and it has been in the Vatican Pinacoteca ever since.
The subject is the moment of Christ's burial, the body being lowered into the tomb by a small group of mourners. The figures include Nicodemus, who holds the body from below, John the Evangelist, young and distressed, supporting Christ's legs, Mary Magdalene on the right, her arms raised in grief, another Mary, hands pressed to her face, and the Virgin, who stands slightly apart, her age and calm a different quality of grief from the others, not the sharp, raw anguish of the younger women, but something older and more absolute. Christ's body is at the center of the composition, and Caravaggio has painted it with a literal weight that is almost unprecedented. The body does not float or glow, it sags. The arm hangs down with genuine gravitational pull. The skin is the color of ash, not the idealized marble pallor of Renaissance Christ figures, but the specific grey-white of a body from which life has departed. The wounds in the hands are dark and real. The symbolic language of the painting works through its use of darkness. Caravaggio's technique, known now as chiaroscuro, the extreme contrast of light and dark, was not invented by him, but he pushed it further than anyone before him, and in this painting he uses it with particular deliberateness. The light in the entombment comes from an unspecified source to the upper left, and it falls on the figures with the unflinching specificity of a spotlight. The hands of Nicodemus, bearing the weight of Christ's body, are fully illuminated, every vein and tendon visible. The face of Christ is lit from below, ghostly and still. The wounds in the palms catch the light and hold it. But the space around and beneath the figures is absolute dark. The tomb into which the body is being lowered is not depicted. It is simply darkness. The body is being carried into darkness, and the light that illuminates it is the last light it will receive, before that darkness receives it. The theological message is held in this tension. The darkness is not empty, it is the darkness of death, which in Christian understanding is not the end, but the threshold. The painting shows the moment of entry into that threshold, the moment between the death on the cross and the resurrection on the third day, the moment when faith requires something more than hope, because there is, in that moment, nothing to point to, nothing visible, nothing confirmed. Just the body in the hands of the living, being carried toward darkness. This is the Caravaggio, not the triumph of the resurrection, but the weight of the body before it, not the glory, but the grief, not the symbol, but the flesh. In a collection full of beauty and grandeur and theological certainty, this painting sits in its room in the Pinacoteca and refuses all of those things. It sits with the uncertainty instead. It asks you to stay in the moment before the miracle and feel what it cost. The Vatican Pinacoteca, the painting gallery, contains several other works that reward the kind of slow, attentive looking we have been practicing tonight. Leonardo da Vinci's unfinished Saint Jerome in the Wilderness hangs in a small room where most visitors pause briefly and move on, perhaps because the painting's incompleteness makes it seem somehow lesser. But the incompleteness is precisely what makes it extraordinary.
Saint Jerome was a 4th century scholar who translated the Bible into Latin, the Vulgate translation, which remained the standard biblical text for more than 1,000 years. He is depicted in this painting as an old man in the wilderness, his body emaciated by ascetic discipline, kneeling in an attitude of profound submission before the cross. One arm extends towards the cross, the other holds a stone with which he is about to beat his own chest. His face is ancient and desperate and absolutely focused.
At his feet, a lion rests with its paw extended, the lion of the legend of Jerome, who supposedly once removed a thorn from a lion's paw and was thereafter accompanied by the grateful animal through his desert years. Because Leonardo never finished the painting, the background is mostly bare undercoat, the preparatory layers visible where the final paint was never applied. This means you can see the process of construction rather than only the finished surface. Jerome's body is mapped out in confident, extraordinary draftsmanship, every hollow and prominence of the aging form rendered with the same anatomical precision that Leonardo brought to his scientific notebooks. The muscles of the extended arm, the jutting bones of the collarbone, the sunken temples of a face that has chosen suffering. It is a meditation on the body as an instrument of the spirit, not the glorified, idealized body of classical sculpture, but the worn, chosen for suffering body of an ascetic who uses physical pain as a method of spiritual focus. It sits at an interesting distance from the Laocoon, whose suffering is imposed, and from the Sistine Chapel ceiling's celebration of physical perfection. Here is a third relationship between spirit and flesh, the body voluntarily reduced, voluntarily stressed, as a vehicle for getting somewhere the comfortable body cannot go. What the unfinished state of the painting adds to this meditation is a kind of metaphorical resonance. Jerome's journey toward God was never finished in his own time. It continues. The painting does not pretend otherwise. Section 15. Numbers, Geometry, and the Architecture of Meaning. We have moved through rooms and galleries, past paintings and sculptures, and woven images and cartographic claims. But there is a layer of symbolic language in the Vatican Museums that operates below all of these, below the surface of the images themselves, in the architecture that contains them, in the shapes of the rooms, the angles of the corridors, the proportions of the doors and arches, the numbers written in stone. Sacred geometry is one of the oldest human attempts to find meaning in the structure of the visible world. The idea, traceable across traditions as different as ancient Egypt, classical Greece, medieval Christianity, and Renaissance Neoplatonism, is that certain numbers and certain geometric relationships are not merely useful conventions, but genuine expressions of a divine order underlying creation. That when you divide a rectangle into the proportions of the golden ratio, you are not simply making something pleasing to the eye, you are aligning yourself with the mathematical structure of the universe. That when you build a room with 8 sides, you are not simply making a convenient shape, you are invoking the theology of the 8th A. The Vatican Museums are full of these decisions. Consider the Bramante staircase, the helical staircase designed by Donato Bramante in the early 16th century as the entrance to the Belvedere courtyard. The staircase spirals upward in a continuous helix, no risers, just a gently sloping ramp that winds around a central column, allowing the passage of people and originally of horses from one level to another without the interruption of individual steps. The spiral form is one of the oldest and most widespread symbols in human visual culture. It appears in Neolithic stone carvings, in Celtic metalwork,
in Roman mosaic floors, in Islamic geometric art, in the Nautilus shell and the galaxy. It represents the movement from the center outward, or from the periphery inward, the journey toward a core truth, the unfolding of something from a single point. In a building full of knowledge and meaning, a spiral staircase is an appropriately suggestive entrance. You ascend by circling. You approach the center by moving around it. You arrive at the top by a path that returns you repeatedly to the same orientation before advancing. The Bramante staircase was rebuilt and extended in the 20th century. The version most visitors see today is a 1932 design by Giuseppe Momo, which adds a second helix descending alongside the ascending spiral, so that the two movements of up and down coil around each other like the strands of a double helix. This was, of course, long before the discovery of DNA structure in 1953, and the visual similarity is coincidence. But it is a coincidence that feels meaningful in a place where coincidences have a way of turning into conversations.
The number 12 appears throughout the Vatican Museums with a frequency that is too regular to be accidental. 12 apostles, 12 sibyls in certain fresco cycles, 12 months reflected in certain decorative programs, 12 as the product of 3, the Trinity, and 4, the earthly dimensions of space, is in Christian numerology the number of the Church, the number of cosmic completeness. When you see 12 figures arrayed in a composition, or 12 sections in a ceiling painting, or 12 columns in a gallery, you are seeing the number that declares this space belongs to the completed structure of the divine plan. The octagon, already mentioned in the context of the baptistery and the tapestry floors, appears in the plan of the octagonal courtyard of the Belvedere, where the greatest sculptures of the collection are housed. The courtyard is not perfectly octagonal, but its corners are cut to create an 8-sided shape, and this choice was deliberate. The courtyard that holds the Laocoon and the Apollo Belvedere, the classical works around which the entire collection organized itself in the beginning, is shaped like a baptistery, like a resurrection space, like the container for the sacred and the transformative.
The golden ratio, the proportion in which a line is divided so that the smaller section is to the larger section, as the larger section is to the whole, appears in the proportions of many of the fresco compositions in the Raphael rooms and in several of the architectural spaces of the museums. Whether Raphael and his workshop used the golden ratio consciously and deliberately, or whether they arrived at it intuitively as a proportion that feels correct, is a question that art historians continue to argue about. What is not in doubt is that the proportions are there, and that they contribute to the sense many visitors have in these rooms of being in spaces that somehow feel more right than spaces usually feel, as though the air itself is arranged correctly. In the Sistine Chapel, the proportions of the room correspond to those given in the Old Testament for the Temple of Solomon: 60 cubits long, 20 cubits wide, 30 cubits high. Whether the dimensions of the original 15th century Sistine Chapel were deliberately calibrated to these proportions, or whether the similarity is approximate rather than precise, the connection was known and acknowledged by contemporaries, who understood the Sistine Chapel as a new Solomon's Temple, the sacred center of a new Jerusalem established in Rome.
And then there is the spiral of the pine cone itself, sitting in its courtyard. Count the scales of a pine cone, and you find 2 series of spirals, one running clockwise, one running counterclockwise, and the number of spirals in each direction corresponds to consecutive numbers in the Fibonacci sequence, 8 and 13. This is not unique to the Vatican pine cone. It is true of all pine cones, and of sunflowers, and of many other natural spiral forms. But in a courtyard deliberately chosen as the symbolic center of the world's largest art collection, a bronze pine cone exhibiting the mathematical structure of natural growth acquires an additional layer of significance. The universe, Fibonacci suggests, has a preference for certain numbers. The architects of the Vatican, building in the tradition of those who believed that divine order is expressed in mathematical relationships, built those numbers into their spaces wherever they could. The result is a collection of rooms that operates not just as a gallery of art, but as an argument about the relationship between beauty and truth, about whether the forms that please the human eye are the same forms through which the universe organizes itself. Walking through the Vatican Museums in this light, you begin to feel that the architecture is not a container for the art, but a part of the art itself, that the spaces and the objects within them are in conversation, and that the full meaning of either requires the presence of the other.
This feeling is not an illusion or a projection. It is the intended effect of a built environment that was designed by architects who understood spatial symbolism, by patrons who understood political theatre, by artists who understood both, to operate on the visitor at every level simultaneously. The proportions press inward from the walls, the numbers repeat through the details. The shapes of rooms and courtyards echo the shapes of theological concepts, and the art within those rooms responds to its container and is shaped by it. There is a moment that many people describe when visiting the Vatican Museums, usually somewhere in the middle of the visit, when the initial excitement has passed and the exhaustion has not yet fully arrived, a moment of sudden, unexpected stillness. The galleries continue around them. Other visitors move past, but for just a few seconds the person stands completely still and has the overwhelming sense that they are in the center of something very large that is also very coherent, that all of this, the ancient and the Renaissance and the medieval and the modern, the pagan and the Christian, the political and the spiritual, the hidden and the visible, belongs together in a way that could not have been planned but feels inevitable. That moment is the architecture doing its work. That moment is 5 centuries of accumulated intentionality arriving at its destination. You may have felt something like it tonight, even at a distance, even through the mediation of words rather than stone. If you did, it is yours. Take it with you into sleep. Your feet know the stone floors now, know the particular give and echo of each gallery. Your eyes have learned to slow down, to stop at things that look quiet on the surface, and wait for them to offer something more. You have stood before the brain inside God's robes, and the self-portrait on the empty skin, and the defeated enemy on the breastplate, and the Caravaggio that refused to make grief beautiful. You have walked between 40 claims of geographical authority, and sat in imagination in a room where Plato and Aristotle argue with their fingers. And what remains after all of it is something that is difficult to put into words, a sense of the place as a whole that is greater than the sum of its parts. The Vatican Museums are the most carefully constructed argument in stone and pigment that any institution has ever made. Every room is a position in that argument. Every object placed in every room is a word in a sentence that has been forming and reforming and revising itself for more than 500 years.
The argument is about power, yes, about the legitimacy of authority and the right to define meaning. But it is also about something else, something that the artists who worked here often seemed to believe more deeply than the institution itself did. It is an argument about the nature of knowledge, about whether truth is singular or multiple, whether it belongs to one tradition or flows through all of them, whether the human mind can be trusted to find it or requires an intermediary to deliver it. Plato pointing up and Aristotle pointing down, the brain inside God's robes, the pagan ferryman rowing through the altar wall of the most sacred space in Christendom.
None of these symbols are accidental. None of them are decorative. They are the arguments of specific people at specific moments in history. People who believed that what they thought was important enough to preserve, even if preservation required concealment, even if the message had to be hidden inside the approved message, like a letter inside a letter. And 500 years later, we are the ones who open the letter. This is the thing about symbols that makes them different from straightforward communication. A direct statement can be agreed with or disagreed with, accepted or rejected, allowed or forbidden. A symbol can be painted on a ceiling and left there for 500 years, and it will wait. It has no urgency. It makes no demands. It simply remains, patient as stone, until someone arrives who has the knowledge and the slowness to recognize it. The Vatican Museums reward slowness more than almost any other place on earth. They punish rushing, not by being unpleasant to the person who rushes, but by offering that person only the surface, only the visible, only the version of the story that was always intended for everyone. The version underneath that one is reserved for those who stop, who look again, who are willing to stand in front of a painting for the 4th time and notice that the shadows are arranged in the shape of a brainstem, who are willing to sit in an empty corridor and feel the proportions of the space pressing gently inward, and wonder what number is being whispered in the ratio of width to height. The symbols of the Vatican Museums do not declare themselves. They offer themselves quietly to whoever is willing to receive them. And the offering is not diminished by 5 centuries of waiting. If anything, it has grown richer, has accumulated the weight of all the other minds that have stood in these same spaces and asked the same questions and found their own parts of the answers. Tonight, we have walked a long way together through these galleries, through the first courtyard where Julius II placed his treasures, through the ceiling where Michelangelo hid the human mind inside the mind of God, through the altar wall where the old ferryman waits with his oar and a man's self-portrait hangs empty in the painted air, through the room where Raphael argued philosophy with 2 fingers and left his melancholy friend scribbling in a corner, through the apartments where a Spanish dynasty painted their mythologies onto chapel walls and possibly fitted the first glimpse of a new continent into the background of a resurrection, through the gallery where maps declared dominion over the entire known world, through the courtyard where a bronze pine cone 2,000 years old still carries its ancient associations with inner sight and cosmic mathematics. We have passed sculptures that were made as propaganda and became art. We have stood in rooms whose architectural proportions are their own kind of theology. We have seen darkness used as a theological argument and floor tiles used as a resurrection symbol.
And now the light is fading and the museums are closing, and it is time to let the place settle back into its long, patient quiet.
The guards make their final circuits through the galleries. A gate closes somewhere deep in the complex, with a sound that echoes off marble and frescoed walls before dying away. The last of the day's visitors have passed through the doors and back out into the city, back to the motor scooters and the coffee bars and the laundry on the upper windows, back to the world that runs at the pace the Vatican does not. Inside, in the dark, the symbols wait. The brain inside the robes of God, the empty skin, the two pointing fingers, the pine cone in its courtyard under the open sky, the maps hanging in their corridor, the Laocoon's face thrown back in an agony that is also a question, the Augusta's breastplate telling its careful lies, the peacocks and their associations with eyes that never close. All of it waiting in the dark for the next person to arrive, the next slow, patient, curious person who walks in and looks up and says, "Wait, what is that?" That is the gift the Vatican Museums offer, quietly and without advertisement, to anyone willing to receive it. Not the certainty of answers, but the pleasure of questions. Not the comfort of the approved version, but the strangeness of the version hidden beneath it. And perhaps that is the deepest symbol of all, that a place this powerful, this ancient, this thoroughly invested in its own authority and grandeur, chose over and over again to house inside itself the art of people who had doubts, who had arguments, who painted their private heresies onto the most public walls available to them, and trusted that somewhere, sometime, someone would know how to look. The walls are still speaking. They never stopped. There is one last thing to say before the night settles in fully. The Vatican Museums, for all their grandeur and complexity, were made by individual people. Specific human beings who got up in the morning with aching backs and paint on their hands and the nagging worry that the work they were doing would not be good enough, would not be understood, would not survive. Michelangelo, working in the dark on his scaffolding, paint dripping onto his closed eyelids, muttering complaints that he had documented in letters and poems. A man of genius and enormous suffering and absolutely intractable will. Raphael, young and confident and technically brilliant, slipping through the door of a chapel he had no permission to enter, so that he could see what his great rival was building in the dark above the altar. Pinturicchio, painting Egyptian gods into the private rooms of the most powerful family in Rome, trusting that beauty would protect the strangeness of the imagery. The anonymous weavers in Brussels, working thread by thread on a loom, somehow persuading wool and silk to follow the vanishing points of a Renaissance painter's design. These people did not know they were making something that would last 500 years. They did not know that their private decisions to hide a brain, to paint a ferryman, to include a turbaned philosopher in a school of Greeks, to arrange the floor tiles in the pattern of the eighth day, would eventually be found, decoded, written about, and talked about
on a quiet evening by someone trying to help a stranger fall asleep.
They simply made the best work they could in the time they had and left it behind. And they trusted, perhaps not consciously, but in the way all artists trust, that the work would find its readers, that somewhere, sometime, in a darkness they could not foresee, someone would slow down enough to notice what they had placed there. That someone might be you. Tonight, you have been that person. You slowed down. You looked carefully at things most people pass by. You let the weight of 5 centuries settle around you without rushing to escape it. You followed the argument of the place from room to room, from symbol to symbol, and arrived at a conclusion that cannot be fully articulated, but that you carry in your body now, in the slight heaviness behind your eyes, in the warmth of the images still glowing somewhere behind your thoughts. That is what good history does. It does not remain in the past. It migrates, it travels forward in the minds of those who receive it, and becomes part of how they see the world, part of the vocabulary they carry into the next morning and the one after that.
And here is the last, quietest thing the Vatican Museums say, if you stay late enough to hear it. That the desire to leave something behind, to paint something true on a wall, to hide a thought inside a cloud of robes, to send a message forward in time to a reader you will never meet, is one of the oldest and most human of all desires. Older than the Church, older than Rome, as old as the first hand pressed against the first cave wall in the firelight, leaving its outline in ochre for the dark to keep. The gesture has not changed, only the walls. And here it is, waiting in the dark of a Roman night, patient and full. You can let your eyes close now. Let the images settle slowly behind them. The long corridors, the high ceilings, the light coming through old windows at the angle of a late afternoon in Rome. Let the bronze pine cone catch a little of that light. Let the brain inside God's arm glow faintly in the dark. Let the empty skin drift between the saved and the damned in the painted air of the Sistine Chapel. And let the stone philosophers point their fingers upward and downward, and ask their eternal question into the quiet. There is so much in this world that is hidden in plain sight, so much that has been patient enough to wait, so much that asks only for the gift of slow attention. You have given it that tonight. Rest now. Let history keep its vigil while you sleep.
If this journey through the Vatican Museums helped quiet your mind tonight, I would love it if you would leave a like on the video. It takes just a moment, and it means the world to a small channel. I am working toward 1,000 subscribers on Heyo Boring History for Sleep, and every single one of you who clicks subscribe brings that milestone a little closer. Leave me a comment too. Tell me where in the world you are and what time it is, and whether you have any sleepy hype left to share. I will read everyone. Thank you for being here. Thank you for being curious. Sleep well.